In this presentation, I will be talking about roots and stems, what we actually mean when we use these words, and why they're useful for us as linguists. Firstly, a root. A root is the irreducible minimum of a word. You can't get any smaller than a root. It's like in terms of physics, it's like the atom of a language. In most cases, the root is not of itself an actual word. It's, except in very rare cases, you would not see a root used in a running text. Let me give you an example. By the way, when we use the mathematical square root sign to indicate that what is being written is a root. Now, look at the root bud. You will not find in any running text in Sanskrit or Pali the word as an independent freestanding word in that form. It is the basic irreducible form from which derivatives of the word are formed. For example, from Bud, we have Buddhi, Buddha, and so on, numerous others as well. We have the verb, the Sanskrit verb, red to indicate it's Sanskrit, to wake up, buddhyate, from the original root Buddha, Buddha. I'll explain why that D comes in. And here it's the same with the U lengthened to O, or varied to O, and with the noun ending E on the end. So all these are words that derive from the root Bud. Other examples are, for example, chit, where we get derivatives, chitta, chetana, the formulation of intention, and that kind of thing. Sometimes you get a little variation when the root then morphs into a usable word. So, for example, we have the root yuj, but from that root we get the j becoming a g, we get yoga. This j to g and ch to k mutation is quite common between verbs and nouns. We have a remnant of it in English, where we have the verb speak and the noun speech, and the verb break and the noun breach. So don't worry about it happening in Sanskrit. We still do it ourselves. So these are the roots that are the irreducible minimum of a word. Now let's come to stems. We have the root, take for example the root vad. Meaning to say, and by extension to teach. We can make a noun out of that. Many roots that have a short a lengthen that a and add an a to become a verbal noun. For example, vada, which just means speaking, and then by extension teaching, as in Theravada, the teaching of the elders. Vada is now a noun, but I've written it here in what's known as the stem form. This is the form that a noun has before you have defined whether it's going to be nominative, accusative, genitive, or singular or plural, or any of the other cases. To this stem, we add endings to indicate what the case is. Sometimes we don't add it, sometimes the A drops, but it's the same principle at play. So, vada. The nominative is vado. The accusative, vadam. The genitive, vadassa. The instrumental, vadena. And so on. Locative, vade, plural, vada. Genitive, plural, vadanam. Locative, plural, vadesu. And so on. So these are the declined, the inflected forms, all coming from this stem. The stem, by the way, is more than just the base on which the inflected forms are built. It serves two other very important functions. Firstly, if you wanted to look up, say you saw the word vadam or vadena in a text, and you wanted to look up the word, you would not look up vadena in the dictionary, and you would not look up vadam in the dictionary. You'd look it up under its stem form, which is the form in which a word is quoted in a dictionary. And when you're talking about a word, or in a grammar book, when you're talking about a word in its uninflected form, that's the form that you will use. And when in English we're talking about, say, what's the meaning of the word vada, buddha, nara, nagara, we will use the stem form. The other very important circumstance in which the stem form is used is when a word is compounded with another word. Where you have a compound of two or more words, only the last element of the compound will be inflected. Okay. Buddha. We can make a compound word, the teaching of the Buddha, the Buddha Dhamma, the Buddha teaching. Here, the Buddha Dhamma. Dhamma I've written here still in its stem form, but supposing we say, I listen to the teaching of the Buddha. You'd put it in the accusative then. You'd add an M to make it accusative. But you would add that accusative ending not to the first element, but only to the second element. So, I listen to the teaching of the Buddha would be Buddha Dhammam Tsunami. I benefit by the teaching of the Buddha. You put that in the instrumental. That would be Buddha Dhammena. And the value of the teaching of the Buddha, you'd put that in the genitive, the Buddha Dhammassa. So as you see here, in the compound word, the first element of it remains unchanged and in its stem form, and the endings, whether it's asa or ena, and so on, are added only to the final element. The same principle applies also with verbs. Let's take the root gum, meaning to go. In fact, it's cognate with our English word come. Most verbs in Pali make their present form by just adding ami, asi, ati. So normal, if this were a regular verb, it would be gamati, which incidentally doesn't exist. Gam is a bit irregular because it forms its present conjugational stem by changing the gum to gutch. So gutch then becomes the stem for the present tense. To that stem, we now add the inflectional endings. I go is gachami. You go, gachasi. He, she, or it goes, gachati. So as you see, the stem, you need to know the stem to conjugate the present tense, but the stem of itself is not an independent word. That stem then becomes a word when you add those endings to it. Back now to roots. When we study Pali, and it's the same for, you'll find it in all or virtually all grammars and books about Pali, the root is quoted in its Sanskrit form. And to answer the question why, I will explain. Let's start off with an analogy from Latin, Italian, and Spanish. Italian for to say is dire. The past tense, I said, is dissi. And in Spanish, to say, the infinitive, decir, and the equivalent of the Italian dissi, I said, is dije. Now, why does dire become dissi? Why does decir become dije in an apparently irregular and illogical manner? If you go back to the Latin root, everything will be completely clear. The Latin for to say, with the root dic and the ending, the verb ending ere, dicere in Latin, to say. It's a third conjugation verb with an S past, so you just add to that root, you add the S. So I said is dix. In fact, it's written Dixie with an X, but that's just a matter of spelling. In fact, the origin is Dixi. Now, in Italian, dicere, the CE in the middle has just been shortened to dire, and the dixi, by standard phonetic mutation between Latin and Italian, the x sound has become a double S, so dixi has become dissi. In Spanish, all that's happened is that the two vowels have switched around, decir instead of dicer. And the dixi, by a standard phonetic mutation, an x sound in Latin often becomes a jota, a ch sound in Spanish. So dixi to dije. If you go back to Latin and see what's happened with Latin dicere dixi, then the apparent illogical irregularity of the Italian dissi and the Spanish dije become fully explained. I'll give you some examples now of how useful it is to use the Sanskrit or Vedic, same for these purposes, stems, and why some Pali words are just inexplicable unless we show how they derive from these primitive Sanskrit roots. Let's take, for example, right view as part of the Noble Eightfold Path is samadhi. Samadhi. So this word ditti, meaning view, can be analyzed back from its Sanskrit root the root drish, meaning to see. A very common way of forming a verbal noun from a root is just to add ti onto the end. So Sanskrit makes drishti. You'll see there's a slight variation in the consonants. Don't worry about that. Drishti. So the sh becomes a sh, but that's normal. Don't worry about that now. So the drishti is formed by, it's a regular formation, adding ti to a verb root. So it means a seeing, drishti, as in buddhi, and so on. Drishti, seeing, and therefore a view. And by normal phonetic mutation, it becomes dikti in Pali. But you would not understand why dikti and what dikti really means unless you trace it back through Sanskrit and back to the Sanskrit root, the root drish. Another one is he wakes up, bujjati. Now, is there a root buj to which you add ati? The answer is no, there isn't. What it is, it's our familiar root bud. There is a certain category of verbs in Sanskrit. You know, you add ati, for he does gachati, vadati, the ati, where you don't just add ati, but you add yet, you insert a ya. So he wakes up is buddhyati. And by standard phonetic mutation, the dhya there becomes a j, a doubled j in Pali, buddhyati, bujjati. So you understand, and it's the same root, of course, as Buddha and Bodhi. The original root is that dh, the aspirated the in the root, but you do not see that unless you trace it back to what it is in Sanskrit, and there you see, then that explains why it's Bujjati in Pali from the same root as Buddha. Let's now look at the words for Pali for mindfulness, sati. And if you contemplate something or remember it, it's anusarati. These are both from the same root, but you will search in vain for anything that could be called a Pali root of either of these words. How does that R come into the verb anusarati? Go back to the Sanskrit root and everything becomes clear. The root is smri, meaning to remember. And as we do with so many nouns, we form a verbal noun by adding ti to the end. So smriti means remembering, and then by extension in Buddhism it means mindfulness. Anusarati, this verb, this forms its present conjugational stem, smri, change the re into smar. It's a regular formation, by the way. I won't trouble you with detail now. So he remembers is smarati. Put the prefix, the verbal prefix anu, the idea of along, following along. He literally remembers along, you think along with it. Anusmarati. And by, again, normal phonetic mutation between Sanskrit and Pali, the sma becomes just a double S. And hey presto, from our root smriti, you now understand anusarati, smriti, smarati, anusmarati, anusarati. I hope now that has given you some explanation of the value of Sanskrit roots and the use of the Sanskrit roots when we're studying Pali. That's it for now.